Hi, Annette. How you doing?
Hi, Maria. I'm fine. How are you?
Excellent. I'm great. Great to see you. We've been talking about this for a very long time, so I'm very excited to be talking to you today. We are doing this episode in English, and we're going to be covering Podemos. The translation in English would be United We Can, but everybody knows them for their Spanish name, Podemos. Podemos is a Spanish political party, and we're going to be talking about the rise and fall of this particular political party because they are the ones that brought woke ideology to Spanish politics at central level. And I sort of thought about it and I thought, I think there's very little content or no content about specific about Podemos, and how they sort of went from the indignados to sort of woke in a very short time. So I thought I'll have a chat with my colleague, friend, and very special person, Annette Pacey. How are you doing, Annette?
I'm great, Maria. Thanks. And I'm really pleased to have this conversation as well because although I lived in Spain over the period that Podemos has risen and become very popular and very powerful and now seems to be on the way down, I feel like I don't really understand many of the details. You know, as a foreigner here, it is quite difficult to keep on top of all of the machinations of Spanish politics. So yeah, I'm hoping that today we can fill in some of the gaps and that it will be relevant for foreigners like me who are interested in Spanish politics, but maybe struggle a little bit with the details because, you know, there's a lot going on. So maybe the best place to start would be for you to explain why Podemos is so important in Spanish politics, because they really have been a phenomenon over the last sort of decade. They came blazing in and really had a huge impact. So what is it that makes them so important to Spanish politics?
Well, Podemos came out of the Indignados movement, the 11th of May movement of 2011, on the back of the financial crisis that became, a huge turning point in Spanish politics. There were massive demonstrations against widespread corruption, the traditional parties, and how they handled the crisis, the economic crisis. There were, of course, austerity measures, and so people took the streets massively. And Podemos sort of, I would say, capitalized and politicized that discontent to actually turn it into eventually a political party. They do identify as a left wing or hard left party, but they don't really. I think one of the most important things that people may not be so familiar with outside of the Spanish speaking community is that they don't actually base their politics on class analysis. I think we can argue that very soon they got captured by identity politics, or, in other words, critical social justice, what is commonly known as woke. So, basically, these ideas of they're very anchored on queer theory, on critical race theory. But of course, in Spain, the critical race theory didn't really take off as it did in the US or the UK, but the queer theory was definitely there, and other aspects of woke ideology that we can talk about. And I think, you see, there's people who have covered Podemos in detail, particularly in Spanish, of course. I mean, there's an Italian journalist called Luca Constantini. He's written 3 books that I highly recommend. They're written in Spanish and they're about Podemos. And it really goes into the details of, their history, their highs and lows. But I don't think we have had anyone covering what sort of there seems to be very little conversation, at least that I'm aware of, on the fact that they were actually the ones that brought woke ideology to a Spanish government. And when I say to Spanish government, I mean to central politics.
Okay. Yeah. So that's their real significant thing that they've changed in Spanish
Yeah.
politics, is they've really introduced this identity politics kind of woke ideology, if you like. And let's have a look at the sort of overview of the timeline. So you say they were born out of the Indignados movement that came from the financial crash in 2008. When was Podemos actually formed, and what were some of the key dates?
Well, they were actually found. So we would be 2011 Indignados movement, but that obviously sort of lasted. And on the spirit of the Indignados, they founded Podemos in, I think it was January of 2014. But actually, that same year in May, they managed to get 5 seats at the European Parliament elections. So that was 80% of the vote. So that was a big surprise, you know. And then eventually the biggest, massive breakthrough, I mean, that was quite unprecedented, you know, because Spanish politics had been dominated by PSOE, the Socialist Workers' Party, and Partido Popular, the sort of conservative, center-conservative party. So that was unprecedented. And that was 2015. I think they managed at one point to have 69 seats. So that would have been over 20% of the vote. So that was, I mean, that was huge. I think that was a time where, you know, we had, for a few years in Spain, we just had so many elections. Seemed like we were always having sort of campaigns and elections. In 2016, they form a coalition. So at the time they were Podemos, and then they changed their name to Unidas Podemos, and they made a coalition with Izquierda Unida, with the United Left Party. And I think in 2016, again, they would have been around the over 20%, or yeah, so that must have been around 71 seats. So it was visually to see them in sort of Congress was quite a thing, right? Because it was definitely very, very much a breakthrough. And then eventually there was a vote of no confidence for the Popular Party in 2018. We had elections and then repeated elections. And in 2019, eventually, they got into power. That's when they formed government. They had, I think, they had dropped in popularity, but by the time they had about 35 seats. But because of our system, you know, our system, we, even if you win the elections, you have to have enough seats in order to articulate a government. So they form a coalition government. The PSOE form a coalition government with them, something they said they would never do, but that's a different story. And so eventually they came to form government in 20 after many negotiations and repeated elections in 2019. And then they got different ministers. We can talk about that if you like a little bit, you know, when we get into the actual sort of politics of Podemos, when they, you know, propose laws and policies. I think if we think back on the sort of timeline, I think in 2021, because Pablo Iglesias stepped down from his vice president, sort of deputy. How do you say that in English when somebody's not the president, but the second in command, deputy?
The deputy or the vice president.
Yeah. So he was vice president for a time, and he ended up stepping down from that role, from that position, to run for the elections in the regional community of Madrid, in the autonomous community of Madrid. He actually lost. He got very, very few votes. And in 2021, he stepped down from, you know, the role of Secretary General of Podemos, and Ione Belarra took over. But I mean, the legend says that he's very much sort of the master sort of puppet, if you like. So he stepped down officially from the role, but he never sort of let go of the power or their sort of decision in terms of a strategy and so on and so forth. And ever since then, I think they've been, you know, on a huge downfall. So this is really like, you know, a rise and a fall that is quite extraordinary in Spanish politics.
And so now, as things stand, they are no longer in government, are they?
No, they're not. They're not.
Okay.
No, there's a long story, but basically, some of the members, high-profile members from Podemos, including the former Minister of Work and so on and so forth, they formed another coalition called Sumar, and they sort of ended up forming another government, another so-called progressive government with the Socialist Workers' Party. So,
Okay. So we have this kind of very fast and powerful rise, and now they've fallen out of favor. But they really had a huge impact on the time when they were influential. So let's go back to the kind of origins and think about the sort of political and economic and context that Podemos was born out of, because Spain went through quite a difficult period around the time of the 2008 financial crash, didn't it? Because before then, there was a big boom of, you know, house prices were going up, and it was all and then the crash came and things were very difficult for a time, and it really had an impact, didn't it? So can you talk a little bit about the context?
yeah, like you said, you know, the financial crisis hit Spain, in a big way. It hit many countries, but you see countries like Ireland, for example, bounce back much faster. But for us was like, you know, and people were very angry also with the austerity measures because, you know, it almost seems, and it actually were the case, that we had to save banks. So we had to save banks from a crisis that we had not created, you know. And of course, there was a lot of anger and resentment towards the establishment political parties, the Socialist Workers' Party and Partido Popular. Like I said, you know, the widespread corruption, you know, corruption is not an anecdotal thing in Spain. I mean, you live here, you're well aware that there's so many cases popping up all the time from different parties, you know, they're basically it's almost like, you know, it's a structural thing. That's what I'm trying to say. You know, corruption is very structural in Spain, from the local level to the regional level to the national level. And at the time when, you know, people could sort of have a good lifestyle, you know, the corruption was there. But then when all of a sudden people lost income, high unemployment, austerity measures, you know, I mean, some people lost their homes. Some people even committed suicide. I mean, it was tragic. It was tragic. You know, the financial crisis hit Spain very, very hard. And so that was the context, you know. And so you had also, which I think is very important, this young, educated population that had been promised that they would have a better life than their parents. So they almost sort of took for granted that they would have, you know, because they'd gone to university and they would be sitting on good jobs, they could afford, you know, to buy a home, to start a family, to do all these kinds of things. And all of a sudden, you know, that was just a very big shift where, you know, you had all these young educated people who had no future. And I think somehow Podemos resonated a lot with this demographic.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the protests at the time. It was really quite a tumultuous time in Spanish politics. So let's talk about some of the key figures. And I mean, there's of course, there's the well-known sort of couple at the head of Podemos, Irene Montero and Pablo Iglesias, but there are some more key figures that we need to know about in the formation of the party and important people.
Yes, the power the powerhouse couple. Do you know in Spain people call them the Marqueses de Galapagar? Or
Right.
some people also call them the Ceausescus, you know. So, but you know, it's interesting because, I mean, they were never a working class sort of party or party looking out for the, you know, for the working class. I mean, the founders of Podemos are Pablo Iglesias, Juan Carlos Monedero. You have also sociology professor Carolina Vescanza and Errejón, who joined the projects very early on, and other. I mean, there's quite a few people, but these were the main sort of people. Irene Montero would come also join a bit later and then rise very fast within Podemos as well. So this is like the rise within the rise, if you know what I mean. But they were university professors, middle class, activists. But these people were very used to thinking and talking and, you know, articulating discourse and narratives, but they didn't really have any experience in management. So they were very much, you know, uni professors, you know, sort of, I don't want to say a stereotype, but, and also I think some of the universities where they come from, this is also important because, for example, Universidad Complutense de Madrid, I studied my master's there, but I have to tell you that university, I mean, it's very much, you know, there's a lot of nepotism within Spanish public universities. So coming from that kind of space, I think, you know, I'm not saying any of them would get their position out of nepotism. Certainly, Errejón, there was a case that somehow he had been given a grant to study, and that was sort of, it was given to him basically with no going through a meritocracy sort of. But anyway, that to cut a long story short, just to say that not only they were not blue collar sort of people, if you know what I mean. They were not from trade unions or things like that. So completely not. But also, I mean, coming from a Spanish university at this point does not guarantee that you are somebody sort of completely, you know, a critical thinker, because to be honest with you, we've seen what's happened to Spanish university, public university has been captured by woke ideology as well, you know, so there's very little or no freedom of speech, you know. As if you're a conservative, you cannot basically even, you know, hold a lecture or a conference at the public university like Complutense. I mean, it's mad. It really is mad. So anyway, these are very much the characters. And one other very important aspect, none of the women that had a high profile or have had a high profile in Podemos come from the women's movement, from the feminist movement. I think that's a very important thing to say for a party that later on sort of claimed to be feminist and be at the forefront of feminist politics, and they just keep throwing the word feminist right, left, and center. I never heard so many times the word feminist being thrown, you know, right, left, and center, but the whole thing being completely emptied out of its political content. So the women didn't have this background. I think that's important. And the men, now we find out, and there's been rumors for years that, I mean, some of the heads of the sort of, you know, their sort of neat clan of Podemos, you know, they were pretty much womanizers. So yeah, so that's I think that's important to say that this is very much the sort of profile from my perspective. Some people can disagree with that, but that's how I see them.
So coming from that kind of academic environment and, you know, maybe a bit of sort of politics, but not on the kind of main stage of national politics, it makes me wonder if their success came as much of a surprise to the people in Podemos themselves as it did to the rest of the country. Because I remember that they became popular very suddenly, and it was something unusual. Everybody was talking about this new party, Podemos, and it was very strange because in the Spanish political system there were two main parties. There were lots of little regional parties, and there were some smaller parties, but really the national political sort of um, stage was all about the two main parties. And so Podemos was really something new.
Oh,
And
yeah.
what was it that made them become so successful so quickly?
Well, the context of economic recession, financial crisis, unemployment obviously was very fertile ground for, organized people to politicize that discontent, which was huge. People who had not been so interested in politics before were very much, there was more of a feeling and a sort of a spirit of people being more interested in politics than before, particularly younger generations. But also I think Podemos is a communications phenomenon. Pablo Iglesias, was on TV, right-wing TV, all sorts of TV, arguing and challenging, the traditional politics and traditional parties. And so that resonated with a lot of viewers. So I think they were very good at communications. Everything was very much built around the personality of Pablo Iglesias as a communicator, challenging traditional parties, legacy parties. But I think another thing is that, of course, this is the beginning of the use of social media in politics in a more sort of mainstreamed way. So I think they also tapped into that. And that was used. And they had, they were activists, so they were involved in different networks and so on and so forth. And they obviously tapped into some of that sort of connections from the Indignados movement. But I think TV played a key role. He was everywhere. Pablo Iglesias was everywhere at the time, and his message resonated with a lot of people. So I think Podemos is fundamentally a communications phenomenon.
Right, yeah. But despite this amazing rise to popularity, there were some cracks really in the foundations right from the beginning, weren't there, that undermined, Podemos and their plan. So can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there were cracks from the very beginning, we saw them soon after they became so huge, but they were actually there from the beginning. Some of the cracks were very much on political. So you'd have the more sort of a strategic or pragmatic sort of faction, and a faction that was sort of more bolder, more radical. So there were definitely, those tensions around the political project. But I also think that the main thing is that, there was a clash of egos, particularly between Pablo Iglesias and Íñigo Errejón. And they were two key figures in Podemos. But at one point, it was really a struggle for the number one role, for power. I think they could not share the spotlight, if you know what I mean. So it was very, very egotistical sort of power trip, I think. There were many other cracks. I think the personality of Pablo, everything was very much built around the personality of Pablo Iglesias. And Podemos at the very beginning had sold this idea of circles where, you'd have people self-organizing, and it would be very sort of organic and more horizontal. But that was actually not true. It was a very sort of not even vertical leadership from Pablo Iglesias, but actually very presidentialist. And of course, that was a huge crack, because again, it goes back to the hypocrisy of do as I tell you to do, not as I actually do myself. And Apart from that, yeah, there's the hypocrisy also on criticizing the lavish lifestyle of politicians, but actually sort of doing the same thing. And I think the feminist thing is their attempt to co-opt and instrumentalize the feminist movement for their own political gain. I think that's actually been a very, very big crack. So there were different things. I would also add, Annette, that when they first kicked off, they were a Spanish political party. They talked to Spanish people. And so, but later on, very soon after they became so big, they started to play more into the whole identity politics of Catalan. Remember with the crisis, the financial crisis, that was one of the things that also contributed in a massive way to the polarization in Spanish politics, including the whole Catalan separatist movement, which went from being much, much smaller to actually quite huge. So I think that was a very bad move, or that was a crack from Podemos. I think they would have been far more successful had they stuck to, we're a Spanish political party. But they soon after, and to this day, they have played into this whole plurinational imaginary, which, it's something that I think a lot of people didn't feel was the priority. There were many other things that were far more important in Spain than the whole, regional identity versus national identity and separatist movement. So I think those are the cracks that were there from the beginning. So egos, big egos, lack of political identity, going from something mainstream to then going to more sort of, plurinational and talking about all these things, the co-optation of feminism and instrumentalization of feminism, Pablo Iglesias being a very vertical leader and not having a real anchor or a real structure across the country. So everything was very much around, sort of built around the personality of Pablo Iglesias. And I think those are quite a few significant cracks, very Madrid center. Some of the Podemos parties, or sort of Podemos, we call them marcas Podemos, the Podemos brand, like in Común Podem or in Catalonia, other parties, we can say they were outside of Madrid, so they had some reach outside of Madrid, but I'm talking more about a structure, an actual structure. Everything was built sort of around the communications personality on TV of Pablo Iglesias. And so there was nothing sort of below, if you know what I mean, no structure. And that's what I think in the end has not made it sustainable.
It's almost like there was a contradiction between that sort of cult of personality around Pablo Iglesias, and yet they were becoming very fragmented across the country with the affiliated groups, and it was hard for them to sort of keep that whole thing coherent.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so they did, even before they eventually came to power by forming a coalition with PSOE, they did lose popularity, didn't they? Like there was a kind of downward slide, and the public did become disillusioned with them. So what were some of the things that happened there that made the public start to lose the sort of initial hope and optimism about this new party?
Definitely the internal tensions, particularly the tension between Pablo Iglesias and Errejón. So how can you put a front that you are going to advance Spanish politics to improve the lives of, your constituency if you're actually, fighting against each other? And it was so visible. It was in the media. And so it was kind of, I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. A lot of people felt very disappointed about this. One very interesting aspect, which at the time, I mean, if I told you now, you think, oh, but that could be anecdotic, but it actually got really, really blown out on the Spanish media is when Podemos and then his partner at the time, and now his partner, Irene Montero, the former Minister of Equality, when they bought a, I don't know, 12,000 square meter, I don't know, huge sort of home with a, I mean, not that the home is massive. I mean, I haven't been there, but it looks definitely by Spanish standards, a lavish home with a swimming pool and really far away from Madrid. And, they go into a mortgage of 600,000 euro, whatever. So it's interesting. Luca Constantine speaks about this on one of his books, that at the time, the media advisor that, they had in Podemos, or head of media, told them, oh, don't worry, this story is going to die down. People might be talking about it 1 or 2 days, but then, they're going to forget about it. But people did not forget about it. People were outraged. People were outraged because all of a sudden it was like, oh, this is a grift. This is a massive grift. You had Pablo Iglesias, who had been saying how horrible politicians that live a lavish life and they have an apartment that costs 600,000 euro and they live outside of Madrid and they're so detached from the people, they're so detached from their reality, they never take public transport, they don't know what's going on in the country, they're so far removed. And yet, the moment that he had, a little bit of cash, he went and bought, a home with a swimming pool in a very sort of, I'd say, definitely not a working class neighborhood. This is La Sierra de Madrid, is where, I mean, by Spanish standards, you're from New Zealand, right? So in New Zealand, I think people are more used to living in homes. Some people would have a pool, but by Spanish standards, where most people live in flats or they live in homes, but, they were, I think, Montero must have been 30 at the time, for two very young people to buy such a property when they're preaching to everyone that, about their virtues, this is the thing. And that's why I say they're woke, because not just because of the queer policies, but also the whole virtue signaling of saying, oh, look at me, I live in a working class background, I never move out from here. And then the moment that you have the opportunities, so people just thought these are just a couple of grifters. It's all about social mobility for them, When they talk about improving the lives of people, they want to improve their own lives, through politics, which is actually what they had been criticizing from the very beginning. See, they used the term casta. In Spanish, it's like a sort of a caste, like a caste system, saying that we have a high caste that are untouchable, live a lavish lifestyle with taxpayer money, they're not accountable to people, so on and so forth. So, I mean, some people would say, well, they bought their home with their own money, they had to inherit some money, and they also had some money. They were both, I think they were both MPs at the time. But you see, it's the hypocrisy that got people. The fact that they would be criticizing where other people live, what other people, did, and then all of a sudden they did it themselves, and in such a short space of time. They didn't wait for a few years to do it. As soon as they had the opportunity, they really went for it. So it was, I think, at that time the grift was exposed.
Yeah, so you can see that the shine was already starting to come off, and
oh yes,
people were starting to get a sense that maybe this was just not this kind of wonderful left revolutionary party that they portrayed themselves to be, and that actually they had a lot more in common with other Spanish politicians, the very same ones that they criticized. And so, yeah, they were already losing popularity, but nevertheless, they did manage to form a coalition with PSOE. And that was that in 2019 that they finally came into power, I think.
yes.
I might not have that right. But then, so then they were actually in government. And that was a time when they really were able to influence, Spanish political life and actually the law, where really they did a lot of things within the Ministry of Equality. So can you explain how that happened and what they did?
Yes. So once they were in power, I think we need to look at the Ministry of Equality, because that was the ministry where, the entry point for woke ideology in Spanish policy at central level. Now, other parties, from separatist parties, from different parties at regional level, had also pushed woke ideology, because let's not forget this comes from universities and so on and so forth. So it was not just Podemos, but as central government, it was definitely Podemos. And it was definitely through the Ministry of Equality. Now, the thing with the Ministry of Equality, I think is important, is that the Socialist Workers' Party, now they have betrayed women big time. But historically, even though they hadn't implemented the full feminist agenda in terms of pornography, abolition of prostitution, so-called surrogacy, they had been very effective in terms of translating the International Convention on the Rights of Women and Girls to a Spanish law. So, and there were many women within the Socialist Workers' Party who really did have a strong background on women's rights and equality between men and women. So they were, their background could be in law, could be in social science, but they definitely, excuse my language, they knew their shit, if you know what I mean. So they were very well prepared. So that was up to that point. Now, when the ministry was handed over to Podemos, and to Irene Montero as the lead, as the Minister of Equality, I mean, Irene Montero was very, very young and had no work experience in her bag, never mind experience on policy making for women's rights. And equality between men and women. I mean, she was basically just somebody who had no professional experience. This is a joke if you think about Spain. I mean, you have to have a PhD in Spain to work on a Pizza Hut, and yet you're a Minister of Equality and, no questions asked. You have no CV to speak for, and all of a sudden you're managing. At one time, she managed the biggest budget that we've ever had in Spain for equality, Anyway, the fact is that also she surrounded herself by her friends, very young women with no experience as well. I mean, so this is like, to put it plainly, it's like a no dream team, So if you are somebody with no experience, I personally wouldn't take a job that I think I'm not fit for. I just wouldn't do it, particularly in such a sensitive issue. But I do believe that they thought women's rights is just like, well, anybody can do it. I just have to say, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, and the job will be done, But the whole entourage of Montero, most of them were also very young with no experience. So, and I think at one point they just took politics as a sort of pajama party, and it was just like, of course, the women from the Socialist Workers' Party, they didn't think that feminist politics belonged to them. They didn't think so, because at the end of the day, even though they always held the Minister of Equality, at the end of the day, the rights of women and girls should transcend any political party, But the fact was that these very young, unexperienced women were going to be taking over, a very, very important ministry. And so I think the idea was, well, at least that they can now roll back what is actually theirs, to safeguard everything. And if they can contribute to make things better, because there's a lot of things that needed to be done and still need to be done, when it comes to women's rights and equality between men and women in government. So that's the
I'm sorry
setup.
to
Yes, no, please.
interject, but I just have a question. Like, is that something? I mean, maybe it hadn't happened in Spanish politics before because there hadn't been such a big coalition partner as
Mm.
Podemos in this coalition. But is that a normal thing to do, to kind of hand over an entire ministry to the junior coalition partner? That seems to me to be quite a strange thing to do. And uh, I don't know, but maybe that's seen as normal. I don't know. It sort of seems like maybe Pessoe thought, well, equality, that doesn't really matter very much. Let's just give that to Podemos. That will keep them happy, and then we can get on with the main business of governing.
I think you're right. I think you're right. That was a huge betray by the Socialist Workers' Party, by PSOE. That was a huge betray to women and girls and to all the legislation on equality between men and women that had been passed and that women for generations had fought for. You know, we have to understand the tradition of Spanish women's movement is very long and, you know, it's not a small history. Everything that women have achieved in Spain has been because of our ancestors fighting for our rights, you know? So it's not a serious business, but I agree with you. Look, our president and the leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, Pedro Sanchez, he would make deals with anyone to remain in power. He's made deals with the separatists. He made deals with Podemos. They handed over, like you say, to a very junior person, a completely like, you know, senior position. This is like the highest position on equality stuff in Spain. So they just made deals to remain in power. And there was so much back and forth at the time between Podemos and the Socialist Workers' Party, because Podemos wanted several ministers. There's even the rumor that Irene Montero didn't want the Ministry of Equality because she thought it was not good enough for her.
It's just a
She
rumor, I
wanted,
guess.
yeah. This is the sheer arrogance, you know. And so again, when they were given this minister, now I think we need to look at this very carefully. All of a sudden, you're given a minister of equality with people with no experience whatsoever. So it's empty, there's no content. So when there's no content, it's very easy for something else to come and capture. When you have solid content, when you have people that know what they're doing, it's very unlikely that, you know, an ideology that goes against the mandate of the ministry is going to be, you see what I mean? So I think that this is what happens when you put people in positions of power that have no experience. And also, I think it's also a question of character, because she could have been humbled. I'm talking about Irene Montero and her entourage, not just Irene Montero. They could have been humbled and say, well, we need the best of the best to come and join us. I think they got a couple of advisors that had a good background, but you see, the majority of people that were making the decisions, they didn't know their eye from their elbow. So what could go wrong? You know what I mean?
Right.
What could go wrong? Yeah.
So that's what you're saying, that because they had no experience and it was kind of empty of content, their way, it was the perfect environment for what you're saying, for the, you know, identity politics and everything to come in and take over, because that's what they knew. They came from universities where that sort of stuff is very you know, current, and so that's what they did. So tell me about some of the laws and the policies that were implemented during Irene Montero's reign in the Ministry of Equality.
Well, one, I think you know them. I'll tell you in detail. But yes, I mean, you have in this pajama party sort of ministry of, oh, we're feminist and it's so much fun, you know, and the whole woke thing, you don't just see it in laws, you see it also in campaigns. They did this stupid campaign basically saying women that if you're overweight you can go to the beach, and it's like, fuck off, excuse my French. It's like, do we need Irene Montero, do Spanish women need Irene Montero to come and tell us in such a patronizing way that we can go to the beach even if we're overweight? I mean, it's insulting, you know. But they did a lot of stuff like that. It's just not one thing, right? So you've got a lot of campaigns and initiatives. You're like, what's going on? You know, they think these people? But when it comes to law, and that's these are the biggies. I think you've got two. The only yes means yes law, and the trans law, the so-called trans law. They say LGBTI and trans, but it's actually really focusing on trans. Which one do you want to talk about first?
Let's do the only yes is yes law, because that's where they, it really was portrayed as something that was, feminist and for women. But it didn't end up having exactly the effects that they had hoped.
Yes. Now, the reason why I say, and I don't use the word woke lightly, the reason why I say this law is woke is because they are on record saying that they had an anti-punitivist approach. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So,
like anti-carceral, like we don't want to put people in prison.
Right.
Basically.
And this goes back all the way back to critical social justice, critical race theory. It goes back to the industrial prison complex of the United States, where, Black and Latino men are disproportionately represented in prison. And there's the whole sort of narrative about the industrial prison complex in the US. Angela Davis, who's a feminist Afro-American activist, she's written widely about that and so on and so forth. And of course, let's not forget the Black Lives Movement with the defund the police. So there's this whole thing, which, again, the US is very different context to Spain. You know what I mean? And even, that's one aspect. But the other aspect is that the feminist movement, one of the key asks and one of the key strategies, objectives in terms of ending violence against women and girls is that we want to revert the lack of impunity, the impunity. There's so much impunity, so many cases are not reported. When they're reported, there's very, very low conviction in Spain, particularly on sexual assault, on sexual violence, rape. So, to actually put the focus on wanting to be anti-punitivist, you use the name carceral, right?
Yeah. Anti-carceral feminism, right. I think is a
yes,
thing. Yeah.
Yes. So that was, but they attach the word feminism to everything. I mean, these people, the word feminism for them is just, it can be attached absolutely to everything. And like a very prominent feminist in Spain, Amelia Valcárcel, says, they must like the word very much because they do not share the agenda. So they just like the word feminist. They must think it sounds very cool to say you're a feminist. But they really threw women under the bus with this one, because what they did in the law with this anti-punitivist approach, and they're on record speaking about this, is that they put sexual abuse and sexual assault all together under one category, sexual assault. And the purpose would be that lesser offenders, in quotes, or things that, are considered abuse, they would be now considered assault, so they would be more serious. So there would be more comprehensive approach to sexual violence, all around consent. But by doing that, they were reducing the sentences. The effect of the law would be reducing the sentences for the more heinous crimes, for the pedophiles, for the gun rapists, for, you know what I mean, for the rapists. And they were actually told. The feminist movement are on record. Everything is documented. We've got receipts, the feminist movement, we got receipts. They were told there's a feminist organization, Temis. They did a report and they say, if you do this, this is going to be the effect. But they didn't listen because they knew better. They knew better. They didn't want to listen to anybody over 50, if you know what I mean. This kind of very sort of millennial, I know everything, you're an old cow, you've got nothing to say to me, I'm an intersectional, whatever. And actually what happened is that the law, when it got implemented, it ended up reducing or releasing predators, sexual offenders, over 1,000 of them.
So what actually happened, if I understand correctly, is that criminals, rapists who were already in prison for sexual offences had their sentences reduced because of the new law coming into effect. And so some of them just got released and some of them stayed in prison for less time. So in the end, the impunity that you were saying was the whole idea of changing the law ended up, being made worse rather than improved.
Absolutely. And I think one of the worst things is that they took no accountability for the whole thing going wrong. All of the sudden, Irene Montero and all her entourage, they were the victims. They were being attacked by patriarchal judges. There was a smear campaign against the law. And it was like, no, you have been told by people who know about lawmaking that this will backfire. Because in Spanish law, when you do these kind of changes, somebody who's already in prison will benefit from the improvements. If you know improvements, I'm not talking about improvements for women, but improvements for prisoners. They actually, so they I don't know if I'm explaining myself clear, but it's actually Spanish law. But I also want to highlight this, Annette, and I think it's very important. This was an initiative by Podemos, but the Socialist Workers' Party, they passed this law, the PSOE. So I think it's important because otherwise we always say, well, Podemos brought the whole woke stuff, but the other ones bought into it just to remain in power. They couldn't care less about feminists that are, that have dedicated their lives to lawmaking. They know their stuff, they're experts. No, not at all. And then, so there was no apology. There was no accountability. They didn't take responsibility to this day. I know, there was particularly one case of one woman who had to change address because she had to move homes because her rapist would be released earlier from prison. So I think a lot of victims and survivors, were really re-victimized and outraged, So this is like, and again, they may have had good intentions at heart, but the thing is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's not enough to have good intentions when you do public policy. And I think in issues so sensitive as sexual violence, the number one thing is do no harm. That should be your mantra. So if you're making public policy, first and foremost, you should do no harm with your policy. And then if you can improve the situation, as you should, that's your way forward. But I think they didn't listen because they knew better, they knew better. And they thought that any criticism to the law, they didn't take it as a criticism to the law and to what would be the negative results on the lives of Spanish women and girls. That was not they thought it was they took it personally. They thought that it was just women from the Socialist Workers' Party from PSOE criticizing them, just, for the sake of it, because they were jealous of them, because they no longer held the Minister of Equality. So I think their narrative really went wrong on that. It shows very immature and a very sort of arrogant way of being a public servant, because it's not about them, it's about the women and girls.
Yeah. And the other main law, as you said, was the famous ley trans. So yeah, let's have a look at that.
Oh dear. So that was eventually, so yes means yes was passed earlier, and late trans was passed, I think, finally on February 2024. So it's quite recent, I think, or 2023 was
I think
passed.
it's 23. So it's
23,
been
you're
about 2
correct.
years now,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, you're
since it came
correct.
into force.
Yes, you're correct. That's right. So basically, this law, the trans law, has introduced self-ID into the Spanish legal system. So we had the protected characteristic of sex has been completely trumped by gender identity, right? So in Spanish law at national level, because you have the regional laws and they have been passed by different governments of different within the political spectrum, not just left-wing governments, but at national level, it was Podemos that brought this initiative with some kind of real obsession to pass this law at any cost. It was just, I think it was the main law of Irene Montero's time in tenure in the ministry. And so what happened is, they pushed for self-ID. They completely ignored CEDAW, the International Convention on the Rights of Women, which in Article 1 is very clear that women suffer discrimination on the basis of sex. And therefore you have many different initiatives in law. And Spain has ratified CEDAW. And when you ratify this international convention, you are accountable as a government to protect the rights of women and girls on the basis of sex. But Irene Montero and her entourage, they shifted completely everything to woke ideology and queer theory. And they took the Yogyakarta principles. Some people don't know about these principles, but they're actually not binding. Nobody has ratified these principles because they're not binding. And they substitute and they introduce self-ID in legislation. So you can change your sex legally in Spain, no questions asked. Any man can change their sex and become legally a woman in Spain, at the tip of the hat. This is what they've done. They have also, they are going against to what they say is conversion therapies, which actually what it means, as we know, is they support gender affirming care. That means that children who are confused about, their sex body, they can have access to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, double mastectomies. And if you're a psychologist and you are doing counseling to a child or a young person that is confused about their identity, you should always affirm that they're trans. Otherwise, you could lose your license, you could be fined up to, I don't know, 150,000 euro. I mean, the whole thing is crazy.
There was a lot of pushback at the time from traditional feminists, actual feminists, let's say, within the PSOE and elsewhere. So it was a big fight, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, we've got receipts, but they pushed this legislation through the back door. And at the time, let's not forget that we had already reports and, changes in law in the UK. The UK stopped the reform of the Gender Recognition Act, didn't they? We had Sweden also, saying, we need to stop giving under 18s any, experimental medical treatment on the basis of this whole gender identity ideology. So we had already so much information about the negative effects of having, self-ID in law. You have then men competing in women's sports in the female category. You end up putting even men who have committed a sexual crime in women's prisons. I mean, just the whole thing. I mean, there was already enough noise out there for them to maybe think about the implications of passing such legislation, but they just didn't care.
I do remember this because I follow this issue, and there was it did seem that they didn't want to have the debate, so there was no that they did their best to make sure that no actual addressing of the issues could take place. And so one thing I definitely remember is that as part of the legislative process, it's necessary to do a public consultation. This is just, part of the process with any law. And so they did the consultation for the shortest possible time they could do it. They did it in August, and also they didn't put out any they didn't talk about it at all on any of the official Ministry of Equality social media. I just remember at the time being just utterly dumbfounded by that, and that it was, just so blatantly dishonest that they, they wanted to do it, they wanted to push it through, and they didn't care about any opposition, and they weren't interested in addressing any of the concerns that come from self-ID. And really with this law, it's mostly about the actual being able to change your sex in the registry with a simple declaration. That is the main part of the law. There's also the conversion therapy stuff, but that at a national level is a huge change. And, and since the law has come into effect, there have been, lots of stories about, men cynically changing their sex in order to get, advantages with pensions and in the army and with custody and all kinds of things like this. But and again, as you said, they were warned about this. And yet they just were determined to push it through. So it seems like that's a real example of them just bringing in this American identity politics into Spanish politics, very single-mindedly, with no room really for an examination of the potential consequences and the groups of people who might be affected by this, namely women and children and also gay people.
Absolutely, Annette. And I'm glad you say that. And I also think that, to add insult to injury, this was passed under the supposedly most feminist government in the history of Spain. So it was really an insult. And I think another thing that is very important is that not only did they not want to debate, no, there have been organized campaigns to smear women, particularly feminists, who have defended women's sex-based rights in Spain. So it's been really a witch hunt. And every time Irene Montero says, "Viva la furia trans," what she's basically calling out for is that, all the backlash that the women's movement, the feminist movement, has got for defending the rights of women and children, more broadly, specifically of girls, because most of the girls affected by this, most of the children affected by this ideology are girls. But there's also boys as well. It's affecting children and it's affecting women. And like you say, it affects LGBT people, because LGBT people also have rights on the basis of same-sex attraction. You see, the Monteros of the world, they've been so damaging to Spanish politics and the noble cause of women and girls. They've introduced all these cisgender, cis women, sex assigned at birth, trans children, people who identify as women, this whole jargon, and they've thrown out of the window the International Convention on the Rights of Women and Girls. And I think it's very tragic, because these are, again, the luxury beliefs of people who live completely detached from reality in their own bubble, So they think it's fine to have, unisex toilets or sort of gender fluid toilets or whatever you call it, in an urban gentrified neighborhood of, I don't know, in the urban gentrified neighborhood of Lavapiés in Madrid. But what about that policy when it's actually, you that are traveling here in Spain from village to village and you take a bus in the middle of nowhere and you have to go to a place and use the bathroom and, it's crazy. It's just like the whole woke ideology on steroids. So for anybody that says, oh, you use the word woke for everything. No, it's a very specific ideology. And Podemos, and we've got receipts, are the political party that brought this ideology to Spanish politics and to law and policy. And I think it's
That's the
tragic.
thing,
Yeah.
really, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
they have now, they're no longer in power. There's that whole story of how Sumar sort of took over, and which we don't have time to go into today. But so now they're on their downward slide, and yet we are left with the problems that they left in the law.
Absolutely.
And they've really made a mark on the law in Spain in a way that endures, even now that Podemos themselves are sort of very much a spent force in Spanish politics. Well, I say they are. Maybe they'll make a comeback yet. Who knows? But yeah. So let's look at that actually. What is the future for Podemos now? Now that they're not in power, I think Irene Montero is an MEP in Europe. Pablo Iglesias is still doing what he loves doing, which is going on TV and telling women
and
to
telling
shut
people
up about their rights. and what's
Did you watch that? Did you watch that?
Yes, I did watch it. Yeah, I did. I thought it was very telling that he didn't have any arguments to defend why men should be allowed to play in women's sport.
Maybe you can give a little bit of context for people listening, because I think that was, oh my God.
Well, it was on a show called 59 Seconds. I only watched the clip online. And there was a great, I think she's a philosopher. She's called Tasia something. And she was defending, protecting the female category in sports and not allowing men to compete in the female category, which seems like a reasonable thing to do. And Pablo Iglesias was absolutely raging at her. He suggested that what she was saying was illegal and that she ought not to say it in a public forum, and that it was transphobia. He was throwing around the slur Nazi. Essentially, he had nothing to say about why men should be allowed to compete in the women's category. He just told her to shut up, basically. So he was still doing what he does best. But so is that the future then for Podemos? They're just going to be a spent force now, where we're just there. I don't know, what can we expect from them in the future?
Yeah, I think Podemos is one of the biggest fiascos of Spanish politics in the last few years. I cannot see how they come back from all the damage they've made. I don't see a comeback. Some people say that Pablo Iglesias would want to come back to politics. I think they're really burnt. They've been very hypocritical, and people are sick and tired of woke. People want real material stuff, and women want their sex-based rights. So I don't think, certainly women from the left have no trust. They've lost all trust in Podemos, because they basically betrayed women. Spanish politics more broadly looks very bleak. But no, I don't see I think this is the downfall of Podemos in real time. What I do believe is that they're going to double down. Like you saw Pablo Iglesias the other day basically telling Tasia, you should shut up because you're a transphobe, you're a bigot. And if you don't think as I think, you shouldn't even be on TV saying this. They don't they don't defend freedom of speech. And I mean, in Spain, we have had freedom of speech for 5 minutes. I mean, not for 5 minutes, but we're a young democracy. So I don't think people are prepared to have, neither Pablo Iglesias nor the whole, wanting to curtail our right to say what we think and how we feel about things. So, but we have an expression in Spanish, you probably know it, van a morir matando. So I think they're
Right.
gonna
Go down fighting. They're going to go down fighting.
killing, not just fighting.
Killing, yeah.
Killing.
Yeah, not just fighting, but killing. In Spanish, it's harder. In English, we say go down fighting. In Spanish,
All right.
you go down killing.
Excellent, excellent. You were doing the actual correct translation. You were doing the correct translation. So yeah. But I think they're gonna double down on this stuff, and so it's gonna get very vicious. But I think more and more people are prepared to put up a fight and defend the rights of women and children, and defend LGBT rights, and defend everybody's rights. I don't have anything against men who identify as women. I think everybody deserves to live a life of dignity, and everybody has human rights. I don't believe, and this is the hill I'm going to die on, that I'm going to give away my rights for the desires of somebody else. So any party that puts men's desire over women's rights, I think their days are numbered. Unfortunately, in Spain, there's also the whole manosphere, and some women as well that are very much against anything to do with feminism. So I think there is the intent to throw the baby with the bathwater, if you know what I mean. So we just have to fight at many different fronts, to keep our human rights and to keep our dignity and to keep our safety. And but I think Podemos is definitely there on the fall. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a hopeful note to end on. And that's been great, Maria. I feel more informed now than at the start of the conversation about the details of Podemos, and their rise and their fall. So thanks very much for informing me.
No, thanks to you, Annette. I think it's great that people who live in Spain are interested and want to find out, foreign people that live in Spain that are interested and want to find out more about, what's really
How things work.
Yeah. I think I appreciate very much that you're interested, and you're very knowledgeable. And I know that you have for the last few years also follow the policy developments in terms of particularly self-ID and the trans law and the impact that has on our rights. So more power to you. I really enjoy this space to be able to put a little bit of history of the party that brought woke ideology to Spanish politics. Right. So,
great. Well, I hope it will be useful to others as well.
Yes. And please, we're going to wrap it up. So please like and subscribe if you'd like to listen to this type of content in Spanish on the rise and fall of Podemos. I'm quite happy to do that. Any feedback, any questions, but please follow the channel, and don't forget to stay unwoke.